On October the 28th, we agreed to the communique that we would both make a joint announcement.
Right.
When and if we could clear it with them, get them signed on. Then the traffic goes out that Nixon will do better by you. I didn't say that with your knowledge. I hope it wasn't. But
my point that I'm making is this: that my God, I would never do anything to encourage Hanoi. I mean, Saigon not to come to the table.
Well, thank you so much for joining me. Many of you have heard something about this story that I will tell to you through 3 President Johnson phone conversations. Perhaps you thought this story was a conspiracy theory or not conclusive. It has, in lore, been referred to as the Chennault Affair. The story being that the 1968 Nixon presidential campaign conspired before the election with the South Vietnamese government to sabotage President Johnson's plans to stage productive peace talks so that a frustrated American electorate would turn to the Republicans as their only hope to end the war. This was Nixon conspiring with a foreign power to win election. We have now learned more about this intrigue. Between 1993 and the final release of the LBJ tapes in 2008, we discovered it was fact that the Nixon campaign did conspire with the South Vietnamese government to sabotage these 1968 peace talks. We know this because Johnson personally ordered his buddy, and they were buddies, J. Edgar Hoover, head of the FBI, to wiretap the South Vietnamese Embassy in Washington. Through these FBI wiretaps and National Security Agency intercepts, we know the Nixon campaign sabotaged these peace talks. Now, what we didn't know was Nixon aware of this activity? It was really treason that his campaign had conducted. This question lingered as a diplomatic and political whodunit for decades afterwards. Well, in 2007, the Nixon Presidential Library finally opened H.R. Haldeman's notes to the public. Haldeman was the Nixon's campaign chief of staff, and researcher John A. Farrell, author of President Nixon, The Life, stumbled upon a smoking gun that year in the course of conducting research for his book. 4 pages of notes Haldeman had scrawled late on an October evening in 1968. "Keep Anna Chennault working on SVN," Haldeman wrote as Nixon barked orders into the phone. They were out to monkey wrench Johnson's election eve initiative, Nixon said. And it worked. Now, you'll need some quick background on this. In the final weeks of the 1968 presidential campaign, President Johnson seemed to be close to a peace agreement with North Vietnam that included a complete bombing halt and the start of 4-way talks involving North Vietnam, South Vietnam, the U.S., and the communist NLF. It's really the same thing as the North Vietnamese communists. They were all one. This potential breakthrough was boosting the presidential campaign of Democrat candidate, then Vice President Hubert Humphrey. The Nixon campaign used Republican figure and fundraiser Anna Chennault as a go-between to communicate with the South Vietnamese government in Saigon, and she delivered messages urging South Vietnamese President Tu to boycott the peace talks, promising that a Nixon administration would offer South Vietnam a better deal once in office. Just days before the election, Tu's government announced it would not attend the Paris talks, causing the peace initiative to collapse and ending Humphrey's momentum and infuriating LBJ because he knew what was going on. President Johnson was aware, as I said, of Nixon's campaign actions through these wiretaps and NSA intercepts of communications between the South Vietnamese Embassy in Washington and Saigon. For example, "Hold on," Anna was heard telling the South Vietnamese ambassador to Washington, "We are gonna win." Johnson considered the interference treason, but did not publicly reveal the information, fearing a national political crisis and having to disclose that the U.S. was spying on its ally and on an American citizen. Additionally, Johnson had no proof Nixon had personally directed or countenanced her actions. Historians scoured archives for evidence that Chennault was following Nixon's instructions, but without much luck. Nixon adamantly and categorically denied involvement throughout his life, while his lawyers fended off efforts to obtain records from the 1968 campaign. I'm going to tell you this story today and in 3 other videos. All of those are LBJ conversation tapes, where LBJ is telling colleagues about the problem and what he has learned. The 3rd LBJ tape is Johnson confronting Nixon in a bracing manner about what Nixon's folks were doing. And Nixon does "For gosh sakes, who's doing that? Are you sure about that?" John Farrell's account of the Chennault Affair is the most up-to-date and revealing exposure of Nixon's intrigue, the product of hours of his archival research, open records, open records request, and a little luck. Listen as investigative reporter Ashton Banks, using Farrell's book and several primary sources, unravels this incredible story to us, and I will follow this video with, as I said, subsequent LBJ tape videos. We are now going to step back into late 1968.
Nixon was especially anxious on the night of October 22, 1968. He had entered the fall campaign with a formidable lead over Vice President Hubert Humphrey, but the polls were narrowing as working-class Democrats returned to their party, and Johnson's efforts to make peace made news. Nixon believed he would prevail, unless a major event reset the political topography. He knew that Johnson knew that too, as did the Soviet Union. Kremlin leaders had never much liked the red-baiting, anti-communist Nixon. To keep him from the Oval Office and help Humphrey become president, they were meddling in the U.S. presidential campaign by pressing their clients in North Vietnam to agree to a ceasefire and hold constructive talks to end the war. According to Haldeman's notes, Henry Kissinger, who worked for the Johnson administration as a part-time consultant and foreign policy advisor, alerted the Nixon campaign that fall that something was up. Johnson was willing to halt the U.S. bombing of the North, and with the Soviets applying pressure on Hanoi to meet certain American conditions, the odds were never better for an early settlement of the conflict. Nixon had no influence in Moscow or Hanoi, but he was not completely vulnerable to events. He had a pipeline to Saigon, where South Vietnamese President Tu and his associates feared that LBJ was selling them out. If Tu would drag his feet and stall the proposed peace talks, Nixon could portray Johnson's failed peace initiative as a desperate political trick. But to do so, Nixon had to get word to Tu and tell him to stand firm. Nixon's main conduit was Chennault, the Chinese-American widow of Claire Chennault, the American aviator who led squadrons of Flying Tigers into battle on behalf of China against the Japanese invaders during World War II. She had many friends in the palaces of South Vietnam, nationalist China, and the other pro-Western countries on the Asian Rim. Nixon also told Haldeman to have Rose Mary Woods, the candidate's devoted secretary, contact another member of the pro-nationalist China lobby, businessman Louis Kung. and have him pressure Thieu as well. The Nixon campaign's sabotage of Johnson's peace process was successful. 9 days later, Thieu's decision to boycott the talks headlined the New York Times and other U.S. newspapers, reminding American voters of their long-harbored mistrust of the wheeler-dealer LBJ and his credibility gap on Vietnam. Humphrey's momentum faded. LBJ was furious. His national security advisor, Walt Rostow, urged him to unmask Nixon's treachery. Humphrey's aides told their boss to expose the episode and disgrace their Republican foes. But Johnson and Humphrey balked. They didn't have proof that Nixon had personally directed her actions. And so Nixon won the 1968 election and led America further into carnage in Southeast Asia. In the years that followed, many elements of the Chennault Affair came to light, but Nixon stuck by his denials that he participated in the scheme. The lack of evidence of Nixon's direct involvement gave pause to historians and offered his loyalists a platform from which to defend him. But Haldeman's notes, found by researcher John Farrell, were the long-sought evidence that Nixon personally intervened to scuttle Johnson's efforts to end the war. It is now possible to reconstruct the events of October and November 1968 with the inescapable conclusion that Nixon's behavior was devious, tragic, and, given the lives at stake, arguably more reprehensible than his activities in the Watergate scandal. It is useful to review just how much Nixon feared the disclosure of the Chennault Affair in the fall of 1968. He lied right from the start to Johnson, saying in a conversation captured on the Johnson White House taping system that he would never sabotage peace talks. The denials continued through the years. To his friend and biographer, Jonathan Aitken, Nixon dismissed the Chennault canard and insisted he had not participated in any such plot. In his memoir, Nixon never mentioned Chennault. To David Frost, in their celebrated 1977 televised interviews, Nixon went to great lengths to categorically deny the story, saying he could not, in good conscience, have done such a horrible thing. The former president had good cause to lie. Nixon's actions to sabotage the peace talks were highly inappropriate, if true, as Kissinger later put it, and in seeming violation of the law that prohibits private citizens from trying to defeat the measures of the U.S. or otherwise meddle in its diplomacy. By the time Election Day had come and gone, there were far too many interests aware of Chennault's actions to keep a lid on the scandal. Several famous journalists advanced the story bit by bit over the years. So did book-writing Johnson administration officials like Clark Clifford and William Bundy, and University of Virginia scholar Ken Hughes in a 2014 book, Chasing Shadows. Anna Chennault wrote a memoir divulging some details, as did Bui Diem, the South Vietnamese ambassador to the United States at the time. The biggest break came when trustees at the Lyndon Johnson Presidential Library decided to make public the tapes and files that LBJ had wanted sealed. The puzzle begins with Anna, the China-born hostess, Nixon campaign fundraiser and grand dame of the China lobby. Some call her the Little Flower, others the Dragon Lady. She lived in a suite at the Watergate apartment building and was escorted about town by the crafty Tommy the Corcoran, who had served in Franklin Roosevelt's brain trust. As a member of the conservative China lobby, which promoted the interests of the nationalist Chinese against the mainland communists, Chennault was a fixture in Republican circles and had an official role organizing women in the Nixon campaign. Though they differed on the details, Chennault and Bui Diem, former South Vietnamese ambassador to the U.S., agree that sometime in early or mid-1968 they met secretly with Nixon and key Nixon advisor John Mitchell, who was to become Nixon's attorney general, in New York. And Nixon made it clear to the South Vietnamese ambassador that Chennault could speak on the candidate's behalf. Haldeman's files show how, in the weeks leading up to the November election, Chennault was in constant contact with the Nixon campaign, and in that same period, the FBI tracked her phone calls and visits to the South Vietnamese Embassy, as well as Ambassador Diem's calls to Saigon, saying that he was in contact with the Nixon entourage. The Nixon campaign, meanwhile, had moles at work inside the Johnson administration and its diplomatic ranks. These included Henry Kissinger, New York Governor Nelson Rockefeller, and CIA Director John McCone. McCone and Kissinger each alerted Nixon to a potential breakthrough. Nixon well remembered the 1966 midterm campaign, when Johnson had flown to Manila on the eve of the election for a conference with Asian leaders and announced a new plan to sway voters. Now Nixon feared Johnson was at it again. In his notes from October 19th, Haldeman gives his first account of the Nixon campaign's backdoor contacts with the South Vietnamese. Mitchell had conveyed word to Nixon that Thieu was feeling tremendous pressure from LBJ and that the South Vietnamese wanted the Republicans to take Saigon's side and determine what the quid pro quo would be for their cooperation. 3 days later, Nixon's longtime friend and advisor, Bryce Harlow, reported from a source in the Johnson White House that a bombing halt was imminent and would be announced with news of promising peace talks as part of a plot to boost Humphrey's chances. Harlow's report and signs of Humphrey's rapidly improving position in the polls prompted Nixon's late-night call to Haldeman. His notes and any question about Nixon's personal involvement in the scuttling of the peace talks. Nixon's mind seemed to be racing, per the Haldeman notes. He wanted others to know he was mad as hell, and he ordered that Chennault keep working on South Vietnam and ordered that CIA Director Richard Helms be threatened to provide inside info if he wanted to keep his job. And Johnson Associates should be informed that he would blast Johnson in a major speech should he use a bombing halt to help Humphrey. Another message came in from Saigon on October 31st, the day Johnson, in a nationally televised address, announced the bombing halt. Johnson had summoned the U.S. commander in Vietnam, General Creighton Abrams, back to Washington and obtained the general's personal support for the plan. Chennault conveyed a different report. "B lady says Abrams screamed like a stuck pig," Haldeman wrote. Throughout, Nixon and his aides viewed Johnson's actions as a crude ploy by the president to help Humphrey. They didn't have access to or put faith in the information the Soviets were supplying the White House, suggesting a peace deal was possible. The records from the Johnson Presidential Library demonstrate that LBJ and his advisors believed they had a viable opportunity to bring an end to the war. The Soviets, who wanted to calm the situation in Vietnam, appeared to be pushing North Vietnam for a breakthrough because the war was costing the Soviets money and was just another irritant to deal with. President Johnson resolved to take the risk. It was with considerable irritation that he discovered from Wall Street insiders that the Nixon campaign was in league with Saigon and out to wreck the peace plan. Johnson ordered government surveillance of Chennault, the South Vietnamese Embassy in Washington, and Chew's office in Saigon, and his irritation turned to anger. On October 30th, the president muttered darkly about Chennault's activities with Senator Richard Russell, the Democrat from Georgia. The next day, Johnson announced the bombing halt. That night, he was beside himself, raging about Nixon's actions in a telephone call to Senator Edward Dirksen of Illinois, the Republican leader in the Senate. "It's despicable. We could stop the killing out there," Johnson insisted. "But they've got this new formula put in there, namely, wait on Nixon, and they're killing 400 or 500 every day waiting on Nixon." The FBI surveillance traced the Little Flower's activities, and she was telling the South Vietnamese to hold on, not to engage in a peace conference. The election was now only a day away. On Monday, November 4th, Johnson held a conference with Rostow, Secretary of State Dean Rusk, and Defense Secretary Clifford to decide if they should make Nixon's treachery public. But Johnson did not have Haldeman's notes, or other absolute proof, as Clifford put it, of Nixon's direct involvement. And Nixon had denied all of it in his November 3rd phone call with the president. Rostow had urged Johnson to blow the whistle and destroy Nixon if the undermining did not stop. But exposing the Republican campaign's treachery on the eve of the November 5th election meant revealing the Johnson administration's surveillance of both a wartime ally and the domestic political opposition. The resulting scandal would taint the next presidency and might cause a fatal break with South Vietnam, and neither Johnson nor Humphrey was willing to pay that price. Even Rostow admitted there was no hard evidence that Mr. Nixon himself is involved. Nixon had taken a great gamble and won. The news of the bombing halt had erased his lead, but his ability to raise doubts about Johnson in the final days allowed him to pull through. Now Nixon was the president-elect, sharing responsibility with the Johnson administration for the outcome of the war. Prodded by Johnson, he changed his tune. In a bracing phone call, Johnson told Nixon that folks close to you, Mrs. Chennault, were telling Chew to drag his feet. He reminded Nixon of the cost of such intrigue. The delay was killing Americans every day, Johnson told his successor. Just as alarming for Nixon was the warning from FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, reflected in Haldeman's notes, that LBJ had the Bureau tapping phones. So Nixon changed course. He instructed a new go-between, veteran American diplomat Robert Murphy, to inform the South Vietnamese that they should cooperate with Johnson. They must not look, Murphy was to tell Saigon, that they were blocking peace at Nixon's behest. Chennault grew bitter as, in the weeks between the election and Nixon's inauguration, word of her role leaked to the press, and the men in the incoming administration distanced themselves. In December 1968, she wrote a long letter to Nixon asking the president-elect to make her his special advisor on Asian affairs. But Nixon and his people abandoned off. She felt forsaken, as she was subjected to severe criticism for activities she conducted at the direct request of the Nixon campaign group. In 1973, Chennault's friend Tommy Corcoran visited Nixon in the Oval Office. In the conversation captured on the White House tapes, Corcoran solicited a favor for her, reminding the president how she kept her mouth shut on Nixon's behalf when the press dug into the Chennault Affair. "Oh yeah," Nixon said. So what was the cost of Nixon's scheming? Looking back in May 1973, as the Watergate scandal exploded in the press, Rostow concluded that the success of the Chennault Affair gave Nixon and his aides a taste for illegal conniving and a false sense of confidence, which led them to their destruction in the Watergate affair. Nixon's meddling also clearly cost the U.S. the possibility of ending the war in the fall of 1968, saving tens of thousands of American and Vietnamese lives and 4 years of excruciating political division at home. In the end, the Chennault episode shut a window that, with the help of the Soviet Union, Johnson and his aides thought they had opened. A moment of genuine hope, and a chance, however slight, to settle this ugly war was stolen. Additionally, having conspired with Nixon to scuttle Johnson's peace process, Thieu was in the position to blackmail the new American president. Thieu emerged from the Chennault Affair convinced that Nixon owed him a great political debt, and attached great weight to it throughout the Nixon years. Thieu fled his country ahead of the advancing North Vietnamese army and died in exile in 2001. Chennault lived on for many years at the Watergate. She kept her bruised feelings to herself until the publication of her 1980 memoir, which she entitled The Education of Anna.
Stand by for my videos with the LBJ conversations we just talked about. You don't want to miss these. They're quite good. Thank you very much for watching Part 1.